Hello, my name is Douglas Comer, and I'm president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, or ICOMOS USA. ICOMOS USA, our national committee, is a nonprofit with a membership largely drawn from heritage scholars and practitioners. This year, 2024, we will begin in earnest to offer those who support our efforts, our national committee efforts, to preserve and protect not just World Heritage Sites, but all heritage sites in a worldwide basis by becoming supporters of ICOMOS USA through a nonprofit established for this purpose called World Heritage USA. Now, it's notable, given that we're going to be talking about the Venice Charter today and how it's used today, that our national committee was the first, but are now 107 ICOMOS national committees. Today in our webinar, we consider the relevance of what most in our field consider to be a foundational, perhaps the foundational document for ICOMOS, the Venice Charter. This document provided guidance for the restoration and preservation of monuments and sites around the world and was developed just in time to be used to repair the damage done to Venice by the floods of the 1960s. And you see behind me a photo taken during those floods, very severe floods, lots of damage, and the Venice Charter provided much needed guidance in adjusting and repairing the damage. The Venice Charter was the first of 13 resolutions adopted by the Second Congress of Architects and Specialists of Historic Buildings. The second resolution in that Congress was put forward by UNESCO, and that established ICOMOS. We live in a time that is rife with threats to heritage through climate change and conflict. Ironically, given that we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Venice Charter this year, flooding threats to that city have only increased given climate change. As we meet, however, we have imminent and very acute threats to heritage by means of conflict and warfare. Our case studies today, we could choose from other places, but today we're taken from Cambodia and Ukraine. Now in Ukraine, the destruction is clearly intended to erase identities created by heritage. A grave concern. We will hear now about how these threats have been and are being addressed. What can we do? We hope that this webinar and discussions to follow will inform us. With that, I turn the proceedings over to Destry Jarvis, our ICOMOS USA Vice President, who will moderate this webinar. Thank you, Destry, and for those of you viewing, please stay in touch. Thank you.
Again, welcome everybody to this webinar on World Monuments Day, or World Heritage Day, if you prefer. I'm Destry Jarvis, Vice President of ICOMOS USA. As Doug said, I've spent my 52-year professional career working in preservation and national parks in the US and around the world. And I've had professional experience in both Ukraine and Cambodia in decades past. We will have three speakers. Each will present. I'll introduce them, and then we'll follow that with Q&A. If you could put your questions online, and I will screen them, and we'll have a discussion when the time comes. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to working with you on the values and purposes of the Venice Charter in the decades ahead. Thank you. We will begin with Roger Negredo Fernandez, Roger has a bachelor's degree in international relations and a master's degree in World Heritage Studies. He has worked in the past for both UNESCO and ICOMOS and ICROM. So he has a broad charter of interest and engagement professionally in the work that the Venice Charter envisions or calls upon us to do. He's participated in the inscription process for several tentative World Heritage List nominations and lived in Rome, Beirut, Berlin, and Barcelona in the course of pursuing those endeavors and others. So Roger, if you would take over, please.
Thank you so much, Destry. I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to the amazing team of World Heritage USA, especially Kat, for the coordination of this impeccable event. The idea of this presentation is to give you a short overview of the historical development that led to the creation of the Venice Charter, as well as seeing the framework in which the Charter operates. So before moving on to my colleague's presentation on case studies from Cambodia and Ukraine, the idea is that we'll briefly deal with some history and international public law applied to heritage protection. So in order to understand the Venice Charter, we need to start in Athens in 1931 with the draft of the Athens Charter, which adopted the first International Congress of Architects and Technicians of Historic Monuments. And the outcome of this Congress was the first attempt to regulate the restoration works on a global scale, per se. And that was done by establishing organizations for restoration advice, ensuring projects were reviewed with expertise, establishing national legislation, national legislation to preserve historic sites, reburying the excavations that were not to be restored, allowing the use of modern techniques and materials during restoration, placing historical sites under custodian protection, or protecting the geographical area surrounding the sites, for example. So even though this was a really nice work, let's say, unfortunately, the events in Europe in the years following the Athens Charter were heavily influenced by the Second World War, in which cultural features were heavily damaged due to the armed conflict. So if we see the aftermath of Second World War, we see that it was the first time in which large-scale destruction as such happened in European cities in both sides of the conflict. And we have the destruction of cultural places such as museums, libraries, historic sites, churches, amongst others, that become a collateral damage in places like Exeter, Dresden, Guernica, etc. So this situation, together with the establishment of the United Nations and of course of UNESCO, led to a milestone, which is the 1954 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, most commonly known as the Hague Convention, which was the first global scale document that set the base for the protection of cultural property. We cannot talk about cultural heritage yet, we talk about cultural property. In the case that would be another conflict of such dimensions. So it is also a few years later, in 1956, that UNESCO also adopted the recommendation on international principles applicable to archaeological excavations. So with the mix of these documents is what led to the creation of the Venice Charter, because on the one hand, we have to protect heritage from armed conflict, and on the other, we have to regulate the conservation, extraction, and management of cultural property operations. It is, it is that, as my colleagues were mentioning, that 3 years later, in 1957, taking account that the Athens Charter was an extremely progressive document for its time, that architects and specialists on historic buildings decided that listing and safeguarding places, as was proposed by the Hague Convention, was not enough. And basically, they met in Paris, France, and they hosted the first International Congress of Architects and Specialists of Historic Buildings, in which it was recommended that countries lacking of a central organization for the protection of historic buildings to provide for the establishment of such authority. And it was also recommended that member states of UNESCO to join the International Center for the Study of the Preservation of Restoration and Restoration of Cultural Property, as we know as ICROM, so one of the advisory bodies to UNESCO. The Congress then agreed on meeting on a second time in Venice, Italy. And it was during that event that the experts concluded that there was need to, on the one hand, regulate the principles of architectural restoration, so updating the Athens Charter, and on the other, create an association for conservation and restoration specialists that was to be independent from the International Council of Museums, from ICOM, And basically, the Congress ended up with, on the one hand, the Venice Charter, the text, and on the other, the creation of ICOMOS, so the International Council of Monuments and Sites, which is why we're here now today, basically. If we see heritage protection, especially in armed conflict, over the years, we see that there has been quite a development since the Second World War, and especially since the Hague Convention in the 1950s. That evolution, of course, includes the Venice Charter, but taking into account that the Venice Charter is not a legally binding document. It's just a principle, a recommendation, a guide of good practices, but it's not the same as some conventions that we will see now. For example, the 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting the preventing, the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, that basically foresees the prevention, restitution, and international cooperation applied to objects and movable heritage. Followed by the 1972 Convention concerning the protection of world cultural and natural heritage, which is commonly known as the World Heritage Convention, that adds on the idea that there's places with outstanding universal value that need to be protected, even when they have been associated with a memory of recent conflict, for example. And following, we have the 1982 Mexico City Declaration on Cultural Policies that basically proposes a more holistic understanding of cultural heritage. So we don't limit it to monuments and to high cultures as we had understood it before, but we also open for folklore and cultural practices and traditional culture to be included into this definition of heritage. And it also includes the fact of colonialism, armed conflict, or foreign occupation as heavily damaging factors for heritage protection. Moving on, we have the UNIDROIT Convention in 1995, not by UNESCO, but by UNIDROIT, on the stolen or illegally exported cultural objects. So adding the idea again of safe transfer for cultural property and of due diligence, also applied to movable heritage. And that it's followed with the Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention that also adds on the idea of protecting sites even when they are found in international waters, not under the national territorial jurisdiction per se. And then we move on to a more intangible component in which we can find, on the one hand, the conventions regarding the intangible cultural heritage. So with a similar scale to the World Heritage Convention, but acknowledging that heritage has dynamism and that basically cultural practices have to be registered in order to be protected. So kind of creating a digital archive for preservation and safeguarding, and also having, on the other hand, the convention protecting on the protection and promotion, of the diversity of cultural expressions on 2005, that basically adds that some exceptions need to be made while allowing the free market regulations in order to protect some endangered cultural practices that could disappear. And basically, the cherry on top would be some United Nations Security Council resolutions, as we have, like 2199 or 2347, that basically deal with heritage destruction and looting, both built and movable heritage, in the context of armed conflict. And this was specifically applied to the war in Syria, in Iraq, and Iraq. So basically, we see, and we have now the full picture, let's say, that all in all, we can see that heritage protection has evolved a lot over time. Basically, in order to adapt to the different conceptions of what heritage means and encompasses, especially since the Second World War. And we must take into account that the Venice Charter, again, despite being non-binding, very short, very old, has set the tone for these documents to come. And if we analyze the Charter specifically, we see that it is a document that is very, very relevant nowadays, even though it's like really, really short and straight to the point. It comes as very fresh because the principles are still applicable today. And even though it only has 16 articles, it covers 5 different areas: conservation, restoration, historic sites, excavations, and publications very efficiently. So if we see the Venice Charter, and before we get into detail, there's a few ideas of high relevance that one needs to understand. The first one is that a monument cannot be separated from its setting, so we cannot understand one without the other. Also adding that all the works of art are of the same importance despite its size, which is something that it's not usually considered as such. The second is that not only the monument cannot be separated from its setting in terms of geographical setting, but also from its cultural context, because it's the context that gives the site meaning. So if we cannot separate the place from the intangible connotations conveyed by the communities that interact with that heritage. The third is that restoration is a highly specialized operation that cannot be carried out by someone conducting the work only. So there has to be a team of specialists basically taking care of that, because restoration conducted by non-specialists can be very, very damaging to the site. And the fourth is that the process not only requires expertise, but analytical and critical illustrated reports that one should easily access. So constant discussion with experts and free access to publication and databases, which is really important. So if we look at the text closely, we see that when it comes to conservation, conservation must be maintained in a permanent basis, not change the layout or decoration of the site, keep the original materials, and only add modifications when strictly needed, not move parts of the architectural features, and if possible, not separate the movable heritage from the site and its setting. So the idea is that the work must be carried out using the original materials, design, layout, ornamentation, but conservation is about preserving the originals rather than making it look new, if that makes any sense in that sense. So, and if we see, on the contrary, restoration, which is a different process, we see that studies are key to understand the site before and after the intervention, that modern techniques are to be accepted. So allowing restorers to always adapt to new techniques and tools, which is essential. Highlighting the relevance of all the historical layers of the building, because usually there's many. Aiming at always making clear that restoration can be distinguished from the original, so not aiming at falsifying, and keeping the site from the unnecessary addition. So in this case, it's not about preserving the original, but further ensuring that one can understand what is original and what has been added later in order to enhance protection. So it's not about building it new, but using all possible means to ensure that the site conveys its original meaning, even with the new bits and pieces. If we move to historic sites, we see that the idea is to protect the site's integrity. So basically keeping the necessary elements inside the area, keeping the size, the right size within the setting, and keeping the site safe from adverse effects. And if we see excavations, we see that they must be carried out following scientific standards. They need to facilitate the understanding of the site and the values that the site conveys. And they must be carefully planned in advance. So the idea here is basically saying, okay, before we start digging and making acknowledging that the digging is a very disruptive technique, let's be sure that we do it in the correct way to damage the remains as little as possible. Okay. So now, 60 years later, we see that the document still keeps its original relevance, even though being old and short, as I was saying before. It has also managed to adapt because it was kept open for new technologies and tools to be welcome within the framework of the charter. So basically, we see that the principles are still valid. We see that ICOMOS, so the organization that was created together with the Venice Charter, has grown exponentially, and we have thousands of members with more than 100 national committees working on the implementation of the Venice Charter in the field. However, sadly, we see that the collateral or deliberate destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict does not seem to come to an end, at least in the current scenario of the world. And this is hence why the Charter is a very, very powerful and pretty much needed document in order to deal with post-conflict recovery. So we have seen in recent armed conflicts cases of heritage weaponization, so basically using heritage as a way of destruction. That basically include some cases such as targeting the sites because of what they mean for a certain group. So targeting the physical attributes that convey one's identity in order to destroy that identity and that cultural and historical preservation, let's say. The use of destruction with a message that can be propaganda, can be blackmailing, can be retaliation, as we have seen, especially in conflicts like in Mali, in Afghanistan, in Syria, or simply just to build on terrorist identity, which happened with Palmyra, for example. They are funding operations with like the looting and selling of cultural artifacts on the black market is something that we also have been seeing recently. The appropriation of some other groups' cultural identity in order to dehumanize them, as we've seen now in Gaza, for example, or the deliberate burning, for example, of books that narrate the history of a certain group, just to name a few cases, right? So once the hostilities are over, it is essential for communities to have access to their heritage because of social, economic, religious, scientific purposes, to name a few. And therefore applying the good practices that the Venice Charter has proposed and that proposed 60 years ago, can be seen as one of the first steps for that to happen, right? So on the one hand, we can use reconstruction of the site for the purpose of reconciliation, peace building, dialogue, engaging always the affected communities. And on the other, we have to acknowledge that this destruction has happened in there. So basically, preserving the remains while reconstructing the damaging parts, but always taking into account that heritage places are very, very powerful storytellers of what happened in there. That being said, I hope that I'm not over time. I just wanted to close with this quote, which I believe is very relevant for us workers in the heritage field that are dedicated to the protection, safeguarding, and management, but also to the dissemination, valorization, and celebration of cultural heritage in all shapes and colors in that sense, which reads, it's not about bricks and stones, it's really about an important message, the way we see human civilization moving and developing. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will be happily answering them after the discussion of my colleagues, and I'm really excited to hear more about Ukraine and Cambodia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger. That was terrific. That was not only super comprehensive, and very rapidly delivered in your time, but a great reminder and refresher of where we've come from, how much has developed, how committed the many places of the world are to the principles of the Venice Charter and all the other documents that have been enacted over the years. And that was a really good summation of it. Appreciate it very much. So now we're going to turn to two specific situations, beginning with Dr. Kateryna Goncharova, who served before the present conflict, before the unmitigated attack from Russia on Ukraine, as the head of the research development at the Ukrainian State Research and Project Institute for Historic Preservation, and in which she covered all aspects of preservation, architectural, historical, research management, and scientific support across the spectrum in Ukraine. Prior to that, interestingly, she was a Fulbright scholar here at the University of Maryland. I live in Baltimore. And I guess since, she'll tell us, but I guess since the conflict has intensified so much and she's had to relocate from Kyiv for safety reasons for her family and self, beginning in 2022, she began work as the Ukraine Heritage Crisis Specialist for the World Monuments Fund. So, Dr. Goncharova, please be safe and tell us what we need to know about the situation and your work.
I will start sharing my screen. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today and to talk a little bit about Ukraine and our situation. So how it looks like right now. So we have a whole bunch of flashbacks, how situation in Ukraine looked like after the World War II and how it looks like in Ukraine right now. So with 80% of occupied territories, without any knowledge about cultural heritage, with a number of cases of deliberate attacks on cultural heritage, with an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity, with illicit trafficking of cultural property and museum collections. We also have a 30% of Ukrainian territory being mined, because there's a lot of issues related with that, and we have no access to the cultural heritage and the territories of our nations right now. So, and the number of people that we had to lose because of the war, some of them had to flee because of the security issues. Some of them had to join the army. We also have not only the question of people leaving that also produce a lot of loss for our economy and social infrastructure, but also raises the question of scarcity of human resources and expertise, but also raises the question, for whom do we preserve cultural heritage? Because some territories are vastly depopulated. And of course, with almost 41 thousand air alerts when everything has to be stopped and people have to find a shelter, it makes our work almost heroic. With the loss of economy that raised the question of resources basically to restore what had been damaged or destroyed during this ongoing war, and the main question of losses of cultural heritage places, places of historic significance, and places of cultural infrastructure that are so vast that I think we need to reconsider, and there were a number of attempts to reconsider the whole framework of preservation, stabilization, restoration, because the scale of damage is way too vast for us to digest and to stick to the norms and procedures that we still need to follow according to Ukrainian legislation. And if we talk about specificity of the Venice Charter and Ukraine, the question is that even though there were a delegation of Ukrainian professionals that took part in discussions that led to acceptance of the Venice Charter, in Ukraine, after it gained independence, there was a gigantic shift towards different discussions about the value of authenticity and the big desire to restore those significant monuments of Ukrainian nations that were destroyed due to the Soviet time. But there was a gigantic shift in the national program to reconstruct those jewels that were so significant for Ukrainian culture that we could not longer exist without them being in our habitat. Saying this, Ukraine is the country where history is something that permanently happening right now. And with an Orange Revolution that started next to St. Michael's Cathedral, that was reconstructed in the 1980s, but in the 1990s, but the authentic cathedral goes all the way to the medieval ages on the same location and was destroyed by Soviet authorities in the 1930s in order to build a governmental bloc for the Soviet government of Ukrainian Republic. This building, even though still has a lot of discussions about its value, its authenticity, its relevance, it gained its historic value due to the Revolution of Dignity, because the monks of this monastery and the people who served at this cathedral, they provided shelter to Ukrainian rebels when they were prosecuted and shot, and during a very early month of the Revolution of Dignity. Therefore, it is a very big chance that heritage sites that are related to historic events in Ukraine will be appreciated by Ukrainian nation and will be given a status of truly significant historic sites, regardless of the value of authenticity that they do not have. So moving forward with the situation that we have right now in Ukraine, while the war is still ongoing, World Monuments Fund took a bold decision to stabilize this one of the most iconic sites that was televised so widely that suddenly gained its significance and was recognized because it was one of the first cultural sites in Ukraine that was deliberately targeted by Russian missiles. And thank you for World WMF for this decision. We were trying to figure out what to do because it was, again, one of the first sites that was professionally stabilized and restored in the situation of ongoing war. So we had, with our local team, full understanding that we are setting up a precedent for further stabilization work in Ukraine. And also, we didn't know what to do, because in the situation of ever-changing events and in situation of uncertainty, we had to rely on the Venice Charter guidance as the much needed roadmap of how to treat the monument. This time in this current war, we had this guidance. And so we began. The story of this building is really rich, and it was built for collection of Ukrainian antiquities in Russian Empire and late 19th century. It was built solely for a personal collection of Vasil Tarnovsky, who's one of the significant family of Ukrainian collectors. And it was one of its kind because there were no other museum dedicated solely for Ukrainian treasures. But this building was erected as such. It served as a community center and then as a library. So it has a lot of events being hosted here. A lot of children were always invited. And then this happened. We had 2 air missiles hit the building from both sides, and even though the gigantic crater on the road was really repaired really fast, not to provide additional hazard for transportation, we still had a gigantic crater 4 meters deep that threatened to devour the rest of the building. So when we approached the site, it was absolutely clean. It was safe for us to get there, no explosive. We obtained all permissions to start the work. And the point is that since the site located in archaeological area, we had to ask for permission for archaeologists to start any work. And after thorough examination, this permission was granted. We had to fill this crater with river sand, not to distract anything from the area around, that hopefully after the war is over will be excavated properly. So we started also collecting and manually dismantling all kinds of building materials and authentic remains that then could be reused when we finally come up with some solutions with a project, the concept of stabilization, restoration of the site. Here you see the wooden elements, authentic stained glass, authentic doors. That we also were able to harvest and clean and preserve authentic brick from the areas that could not longer stay, and so we were hoping to use that brick when we needed to reconstruct certain elements of the building. And then in the end of 2002, we had the building perfectly stabilized. There were no further development of a state of emergency. We winterized that for this almost ruined structure to survive the winter. And then we took some time off to think, how could we go on with stabilization project? And that laid a whole ground for a whole bunch of professional discussions, scientific meetings with experts and locals to come up with any idea. So the main concept of the project was that the building largely gained its significance because of the very recent page in its history, because of this cultural site being targeted by air missile. And so we wanted to come up with idea how to mark this very last page of the building history on its facade. There were a bunch of discussion, number of project solutions, and in the end, we decided that the building will have this very elegant scarf on its facade, that the body of the building will always remain wounded, but all our committees vote in favor of this very conservative look of restored facade. We also had to restore this little addition that proved to be authentic, but technical condition of this adding was in such a dull state that we had to basically rebuild it. And also providing additional space so much needed for cultural center and for the library. Also setting up a precedent for procedure, how to mark the very recent history in restored buildings, how to museumify the war that we're still fighting, in the situation of preservation projects. So as you may see, after long discussion, developing project, receiving all approvals as required by the Ukrainian legislation, we started to rebuild the facade of the wall using authentic bricks that we were able to preserve previously, without knowing actually that we're gonna be going that far in stabilization of the site. But sadly, we also had to use new materials, like reinforcing some key construction like this arch, because otherwise it would be absolutely impossible or too costly for us to rely only on authentic materials and techniques, since the geometry of the building was ruined by an explosion waves both way. We were also using new bricks for this adding that was absolutely mandatory to restore according to approved project. And so this is where we are now. For now, the building is perfectly stable. Perimeter walls were restored with a full understanding and appreciation of authenticity of the site. And now we are basically covering the roof using the same materials, the same patterns that were at the building authentically. And we still have a lot of issues that we're hoping to cover on the third stage of a stabilization project with the Library of Youth Museum of Ukrainian Antiquities, but we'll need to deal with a lot of issues related to mural painting, authentic wooden elements, authentic floor that we found under the plywoods and things like this. Hopefully the security situation in Chernihiv will allow us to pursue. And even though the martial law and a lot of other obstacles did not allow us to engage public as much as we would like to into decision-making process, the local community really loved the project and really loved the fact that we're working with the site that they love so much and appreciate. The last Christmas, one of the local residents baked a gingerbread house in the form of the Library of Youth, and it went viral. People really loved that. There were some little events devoted to this project that only locals organized for a small amount of people that would be safe. And so we do really hope that the security situation will allow us to go forward with this project, and we will be in a year or two cutting ribbons and raising a glass of champagne in a completely safe environment, celebrating the reopening of the Library of Youth Museum of Ukrainian Antiquities in Chernihiv. So thank you for being with me. Please ask any questions. I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goncharova. That was really gripping and informative. You've done amazing work in the midst of conflict, and that's unique. Our next speaker will be Dr. Jonathan Bell, who's Vice President of Programs at World Monument Fund at present. He has a bachelor's from Harvard, a master's in historic preservation from Columbia, and a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. And he has worked around the globe on projects of cultural heritage for World Monuments Fund, including work in China and Egypt, Kazakhstan to Colombia, and on other projects. There's much going on in Southeast Asia, some of which the United States caused to happen, some of which the United States continues to need to help recover. And the work in Cambodia is, I think, emblematic of that. So, Dr. Bell, please let us know what's going on and what you've been doing, and hopefully how the United States can help going forward.
Thanks so much, Destry, and thank you to ICOMOS USA for organizing this. One of the things that we thought about is considering the legacy of the Venice Charter in professionalizing and formalizing the field over these many decades, 6 decades now, was it might be good to look at that through the lens of a project that has itself been over 30 years in the making. So with that, I take us all to Cambodia, to the Angkor Archaeological Park. This is many of you will be familiar with this and the history of it, the seat of the Khmer Empire and a number of capitals of the Khmer Empire from about the 9th to the 15th centuries. And it's also the site of the largest pre-industrial city in the world. And I think through the work that we've been involved in as World Monuments Fund over the past 30 plus years, we'll be able to see kind of some of the principles of the Venice Charter in action. But also I want to highlight some of the things that the Venice Charter and even subsequent charters don't talk enough about, and that we as a profession are doing more with and thinking about and trying to develop tools for. So, of course, I'm sure everybody on this call and this webinar will be familiar with the very dark chapter of Cambodia's past, the Cambodian genocide that wiped out over 2 million people, which at that time was a quarter of the entire population of the country. And with that, as we well know, when we see these types of traumatic events, heritage also suffers. And so many of the people who were lost during the genocide were also the keepers and the historians and the archaeologists who were familiar with many of the incredible sites in Cambodia. And so a lot of that knowledge was lost. And World Monuments Fund was the first Western organization to come back in 1989 after the completion of the genocide, or the end of the genocide. And at the request of the then king, started working to try to reintroduce and reestablish a professional practice of preservation. And sorry for this blurry photo, but this photo is indeed from 89 when we were there at that time, so a little bit blurry. But the focus of the work was to obviously do good conservation work at the Angkor Archaeological Park, but also to really reestablish this profession that had been lost and bring to the fore all of the great kind of scientific approaches and practices that are espoused in the Venice Charter and other subsequent charters. So our first project began at Preah Khan. This is a formidable, incredible, expansive temple dedicated at the end of the 12th century by the famous King Jayavarman VII. This temple spans 138 acres, if you can picture that. It has a protective moat, fortified walls, and in its heyday, when it was functioning, it would have had about 100,000 officials and servants just to keep it operating on a daily basis. Our work there really focused on the stabilization of the site, the reintroduction and I guess restoration and restitution of these main axes through the site so that the site could be understood. So a lot of it was writing and stabilizing the original elements that had in many cases collapsed and fallen. And it was very difficult not only to access the site and walk through it, but to really understand its layout and the original circulation. This is the famed Hall of the Dancers. So a lot of that work was done to obviously preserve the site, but also allow it to be visited safely and better understand what was happening there. I should mention that we also established a small interpretation center, not only telling the history and the story of the place, but also the story of the conservation and all the work that was required and the approaches used. I always like to show this photo because I think many people, when they think of Angkor, they think of these sorts of images of the strangling ficus trees that seem to be sucking the life out of buildings. But it does bring up an interesting concept when we talk about accretions and the history to which cultural places bear witness. There's also this sort of dilemma, what do you do with something like this? And in this case, there was also a clear conservation approach. It would have been very difficult to remove this tree and potentially damage the historic fabric, but it also allows us to tell the story of that long period of time when much of the Angkor Archaeological Park was, in fact, very much eaten up by the nature around it. Another site we worked, perhaps arguably, perhaps undeniably, the most famous site within the Angkor Archaeological Park is Angkor Wat. This, of course, is a huge, actually the largest religious monument in the world on 400 acres. And we were able to focus on one of the galleries known as the Gallery of the Churning of the Ocean of Milk, Samudra Manthan in Sanskrit, which depicts kind of Hindu creation myth of the battle between good and evil, from which come the elixir of life and deities and certain aspects of the world around us. And you have 50 meters, so what is that, 150 feet or so of incredible bas-relief depicting this, this moment in Hindu myth. But we were not focused on the bas-relief itself, we were actually focused on the roof. And this highlights another one of the challenges that many of us in the field have faced on the ground: inappropriate and ineffective previous interventions. Here, the roof, in an effort to keep it from leaking, had been treated with quite a bit of cement throughout. And as we all know here, that often doesn't work and often introduces new problems. So our focus here was actually removing that intervention, removing the cement that had been used, and actually restoring the traditional historic drainage, the original drainage and kind of watershed elements that were used on the roof, enhancing them to make sure that it was all waterproof, but really restoring that traditional knowledge and traditional component of the structure. And the last site I'll talk about is a really interesting project, and it's become kind of one of our larger projects, Phnom Bakaing. This is actually one of the oldest temples, one of the oldest extant temples at the site. It dates back to the end of the 9th century, and it's a huge, I often refer to it as a man-made mountain. It's really a huge stepped pyramidal structure that, with its age, of course, had undergone a number of challenges. And this also brings up the role and the challenge of tourism. Those of you who've been to the site may have yourself climbed this and been one of the thousands of tourists who daily climb it to watch the sunset behind Angkor Wat. So we can all imagine that already an aging structure that had structural issues, had waterproofing issues, with that constant traffic, the weight, the vibration, that was really exacerbating the challenges of the structure. And so our work has been to, since 2008, when we began the physical work here, to painstakingly remove the stone, get into the structural core, stabilize it, include waterproofing, and when possible, replace the original stones. In other cases, when we're not using new stone because the stone is so deteriorated, we're trying to find other historic stone that's in and around the site and use that, which has been an incredible process. And we have some incredible team members who are excellent at sizing up a stone from a distance and saying, that's the one that will fit. But you can see the amount of work we've done in the green in the upper right-hand corner. We actually recently just finished the 3rd corner, and so we have that the white area remaining to complete the work. And I want to just acknowledge here in this project, Destry, you mentioned, the U.S. government has some things to do in this part of the world, and I do want to recognize that a lot of the work at this site has been with the support of the U.S. State Department through its Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, as well as through the Robert W. Wilson Charitable Trust. So I just want to recognize those two key partners that have allowed us to have this long-term project. And the thing I want to really end on that I'll say is really more the focus of my talk, because I think it's the more interesting piece. That's all great work. It's been very professionally done. But throughout that process, and particularly in this effort to reestablish professional preservation in Cambodia, we have really had a lot of local impact, and I would even say regional and national level impact to the work we've been done. And I think it's something that we as professionals are now asking ourselves and trying to measure and evaluate more and more, but we don't always have the right tools to do it or the capacity. And the fact that we've been here for now 35 years has allowed us to really look back over what we've done, look back at the numbers, talk to our local partners and our team members on site, and understand what some of the other types of impact, in addition to that first bullet, professional conservation at 4 sites. So one of the key things that's come out, and this has come from qualitative research of our team, and I should highlight that our team at many moments, many periods of time, has been about 100 strong full-time employees on the ground, local Cambodians. And many of them, majority of them, do not have a high level of education. They've only completed a few years of education. So one of the things that they highlight in what working with us and on a preservation project of this length has been this long-term stability of employment, which has allowed them to invest in housing and land for the first time, allowed them to put their children and grandchildren through higher education, and also allow them to be more mobile, investing in motorbikes and things like that to get around. All of this has led to an improvement in the quality of life that they lead. And I think this is a key component that we often talk about. We often talk about the meaning of heritage and what it does, but I think we also need to talk sometimes about the active preservation and what that brings to the floor and to people's lives. Of course, one of the key objectives here was to reestablish and enhance local capacity. And we have a very professional trained team. And I would say that the Angkor Archaeological Park, now in the hands of Apsara, which is the kind of governmental organization that oversees the whole park, is indeed very professional. It's not just due to World Monuments Fund contribution. There are many missions from waving the flags of many countries that are there doing this work day in, day out, but altogether the active preservation, working with local team members, has really brought a high level of skill and capacity to Siem Reap and to Cambodian professionals. And I have a slide that I'll show in a minute just to kind of highlight that. But the other thing that we should always remember too is, of course, the compound effect on tourism. Tourism is one of the main sources of revenue, one of the main industries of the Kingdom of Cambodia. Before the pandemic, there were 6.6 million tourism arrivals that year before in 2019. As of the numbers at the end of last year, we're basically back to that. It represents a roughly $1 billion industry. And we all know that most people going to Cambodia for tourism are at some point going to the Angkor Archaeological Park. So this has been a huge contribution to the economy on a national level, and I would even argue to political stability. So there's a lot here and a lot that I think our professional charters need to tackle with a bit more. Just two things in kind of graphic form of what we've done to give you a sense. Over the years, we've invested about $20 million in projects in Cambodia, mostly at the Angkor Archaeological Park. Over a quarter of that has gone directly to local staff, local Cambodian staff. And that equivalent is employing 3,000 full-time people for a year. And we know that many of these people are the sole breadwinners. They have dependents, children, spouses, elderly parents, perhaps. And so we see that kind of that effect really is supporting about 10,000 people in a year. It's the equivalent of 10,000 people in a year. So a huge economic effect, a huge impact on the lives of people because of this active preservation. I promised you a slide about capacity building, and I think there's no better way to show this than in the numbers, in the investment. This is a graph that shows the investment, the percentage of annual budget going to foreign consultants, that is non-Cambodian consultants. For various reasons, we started this in 2002, just because we're really sure and accessible data. But you can see a pickup in kind of 2004, 5, 6, 7, where we're beginning the planning work for Phnom Bakang, that large project. A lot of foreign consultants involved. At its peak, 70% of the budget paid foreign consultants. As we get down to 2020, we're down to only 10%. It's not because we're doing less work. It's because we have a fully trained, professional, very capable Cambodian team. And I can tell you that in the last 2 years, that percentage is even less. So this is real proof of capacity building on the ground. And again, a key part of what we're all talking about. I always say I hope to put myself out of a job, that there are locals who know how to do this. I don't have to come in and help them, or I and my team don't have to do that. So I will stop there and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was terrific. I'm gonna, while we're waiting for people to put their questions up, I see there are several. I'm gonna ask Jonathan, to what extent is the work you've done, the World Monuments Fund has done over 30 years, a model that can be applied other places post-conflict? And I think particularly of Ukraine, because obviously Ukraine has very qualified professionals already hard at work during the conflict, unlike the situation was in Cambodia 30 years ago. Do you have, or are you looking for other places where that particular model would work? And what do you think about other situations like Ukraine or in Gaza and Palestine, where the work that's needed will be needed for long periods of time, as you have done in Cambodia, but would be presumably different? Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, the exact model, as we all know, we have to adapt to the local needs and local realities, and the exact model of a 30+ year project is difficult. I mean, we've been very lucky just in that we've been able to continue to fund it and find the funding to continue that work on the ground. But I think the key approach is definitely something that can be replicated in terms of bringing in the expertise, working very closely with local partners and training them, building those skills. If there are skills that have been lost, bringing those back. In the case of Ukraine, and Kateryna can say more about this, we've had the very unique opportunity of being there, as she was saying, as this is unfolding. And in the case of Ukraine also, we have the wonderful benefit and opportunity of a very high level of capacity, professional capacity, that's there and that's still on the ground, with whom we're working on a regular basis. I will just mention, because you asked about kind of other places where this could work, we're doing this in other places as well. We've been in Iraq for a number of years, since about 2007, 2008. We have a large project at the archaeological site of Babylon, where we've been since that time. We are also now working a very large project in Mosul on the Mosul Cultural Museum. And all of these are post-conflict recovery projects that are about, yes, preserving and saving these places, and in many cases repairing them, but really building out professional teams who can continue the work once we're gone. And also, I would say, working with local communities to help bring back that sense of safety, of security, and normalcy that they so long for after conflict.
Cool. Looking at the questions we've gotten here, one person has asked Kateryna about the involvement of the library staff and other local experts in carrying out the work that you've done. Did they contribute significantly, or did the expertise to do the restoration come from beyond Cherniev?
Thank you for asking this question, because actually the workers of the library did a fantastically heroic job, and partly this episode is covered in the movie called Erasing the Nation. You can easily find it on YouTube. This movie is actually a documentary about cultural crimes in Ukraine in ongoing war. We also covered this episode in our exhibition in Google Arts and Culture devoted to our project in Chernihiv. We ask for the local support and local expertise, but the crew that designed the project and implemented the project was from Kiev. mainly because when we only put our foot on the ground, the city was just liberated because there was a gigantic siege laid upon Chernihiv. And so there were only 1/3 of population still living in the city. So when we approached the site and approached the regional administration, there were very few people, and we need to rely for expertise somewhere outside of Chernihiv. But still, local experts were vastly engaged in decision-making process through a number of consultations and scientific meetings and things like this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kateryna. So this is a question that really could go to all the three of you, and you can take it as you wish. What the questioner asks, is there any part of the Venice Charter that encourages or provides guidance for cultural preservation professionals and what they should be doing before the damage occurs, and following up on restoration? I mean, I know we've seen the pictures in Ukraine of sandbagging around cultural sites before they're bombed, but is there any guidance in the Venice Charter that gives professionals some guidance as to what they could be doing even during conflict?
I can jump on that if you,
Please, yeah.
So there's not such a thing in the Venice Charter, because as we were saying, the Venice Charter is a relatively short document. It's really 4 pages if you really look it into detail. But it basically entails everything that has to be done while the reconstruction is happening, but not before. So that's not included. But of course, you have a wide set of documents that deal with basically all the strategies for doing an excavation, which as little impact as possible. For example, the different strategies for preventive conservation, all the techniques, all the tools that you can use. And basically, UNESCO is now offering, and you have them online, a wide set of manuals and guidelines. Also, ICOMOS has many, in order on how to do that and how to basically prevent that and how to be ready for that. You have also a bunch of programs also led by UNESCO, ICOMOS, the Ali Foundation, the Cultural Emergency Response in the Netherlands, the FAR ICOMOS as well. So basically you have a lot of organizations working for that, doing capacity building programs and making sure that people know how to do that. So basically when I was working on UNESCO, for example, we were doing that for professionals in Syria. So how to train them in order to evacuate a museum, how to train them in order to document some art that could be looted, how to allow them or teach them how to take proper pictures for the inventories. And this is something that we had to adapt over time, because there's no such a document, like an old document, a convention saying so, but there's a few legal documents that one could use and that basically highlight the good practices for doing so.
Yeah. Any thought on that, Jonathan or Kateryna? Otherwise, we'll go on to some more questions.
Just to echo that, there are so many good organizations, and we've had the honor and pleasure of working with many of them who are very much focused on this exact, what to do in a time of crisis. And Roger mentioned a number of them, but I think it's always, and there are people who are specialists in this, absolutely, but I think it's always a bit of learning on the ground too, as it happens. And we hope, we haven't quite figured out how or what that will look like, but we hope from our experience with Kateryna and Ukraine also to be able to share some of those lessons learned and are doing that on the fly with some of our colleagues there as well. So I think we all have more to learn, and we just need to be sharing things as we figure out strategies and approaches.
Thanks. Please.
I can only add that regardless of a gigantic amount of whole bunch of recommendations and guidelines, what to do in pre-crisis preparation, when the crisis actually strikes, there is a lot of uncertainty, because the phone numbers that you're supposed to be calling are out of order. People you're supposed to be contacted are evacuating or joining the army. So there is a lot of uncertainty. And if there are a lot of recommendations how to behave and how to preserve museum collections and movable objects, There are not a single one, except for putting an emblem of a blue shield on the facade of architectural sites. So there are no instruments to protect an architectural site from the risks of being destroyed, except for 3D scanning and collecting a whole bunch of documents that could be used in post-war reconstruction. Otherwise, the main thing that, for example, we were organizing a number of workshops for museum workers and cultural workers on occupied and endangered areas on how to behave when the occupiers are knocking off the doors of your museum, what to do, because it's largely a practical experience that people share between one another. It's not documented or institutionalized in any way, because sometimes when the crisis occur, you have to rely on someone's practical experience. And this is what actually makes this current war an experience that we're gaining during it so advanced. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I just add one thing, because this is a great example, and Kateryna actually led this project. I'm thinking, Kateryna, about the Black House in Lviv. You know, we did something very interesting there. This was funded by, again, the State Department Ambassadors Fund. And there was a real eagerness to protect the facade of that building that had just recently been conserved. And so we worked with a number of engineers and architects to come up with kind of a protective boxing of the entire facade. Obviously wouldn't protect from a direct missile strike, but would protect from collateral damage. And so it's those sorts of thinking on your feet, devising new ways to do things and see if we can protect things. And that is still in place and has a beautiful drop cloth that is an exact replica of the facade that's kind of become part of the landscape there in Lviv.
Very good. Another questioner from Milan, Italy, is asking, in cases of active conflict, based on your all's different experiences, are there situations where government rules, regulations, policies are softened or shortened than would normally apply in a normal situation, recognizing that more damage it could occur, that stabilization is an emergency and that sort of thing? Or do you know situations where the process that the federal government requires, and I know that process very, very, very well here in the U.S., gets in the way of the immediacy or the urgency of a disaster or active conflict? Any experience with that either way?
I mean, I would actually ask Kateryna to talk about that because I know she's faced that on a daily basis.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. We had this experience of a little easement of project documentation procedure, or developing a project and approving of project documentation procedure in Ukraine, like 18 months ago. It was very helpful. It's only about the projects on urgent stabilization of those sites that were affected by military actions in Ukraine. And this is what we were using when we could, when it was relevant, and when the destruction did not touch the authentic parts of the building, meaning there were some old, relatively recent repairment of the roof or something like that. This case, we could go forward with a very easy approval procedures. But I think this is something that we need to consider and develop, considering the scale of damage and the scale of ruins, especially advocating cultural heritage as one of the reasons why we are having this war. And of course, it's getting hard because the legislation procedures are, like pretty much everywhere, very slow. And when the Ministry of Defense comes and issues his bill, of course, it's an ultimate priority. Thank you.
So I have one question here, very specific to Cambodia, Jonathan. Questioner asks, does Cambodia invest in sites beyond Angkor? And she asked specifically about a place called Prey Vihir, Prehvihear, which I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Cambodian government takes its cultural heritage very seriously. So there is definitely a lot of investment from, well, Ministry of Finance, and then kind of managed by the Ministry of Culture. And also there is often money coming in from other countries. Pray over here. I know that, for instance, the US government has supported projects there. And I think there are some other, there are some missions from various countries that are there as well. So that's a very active project site, not one of, not a place where World Minds Fund is currently working though.
Okay, I have a question for Kateryna. This goes back some time, I guess, to your Fulbright work. I know you were doing some studying of the U.S. process for procedure in the U.S. for working with partnerships, working with other organizations, creating partnerships, and so forth. I'm wondering if you drew anything from that knowledge that you've been able to see applied in Ukraine.
Yes, sure. My Fulbright scholarship was devoted to public-private partnership and public engagement techniques, approaches that built the basis for historic preservation in the US. And of course, it came very handy when I came back to Ukraine and started my work in historic preservation. But the point is that Ukrainian society developed so fast that after 5 years, my experience, for example, of community engagement was almost irrelevant, because there were, again, a lot of advanced practices already happening in Ukraine with experts who know how to question, know how to gather knowledge from the local grounds. But of course, I use it in my everyday practice when I can. As for a public-private partnership, this is something that Ukraine needs to lay foundation in terms of legal framework, how it can actually happens. Otherwise, that was fantastic experience for me, and of course, my professional skills only developed through that, and it's beneficial for our project and our partnerships here in Ukraine.
Thank you. So it looks like our time has run its course. Any final thoughts or last comments from any of the three of you? This has been excellent. You've all contributed enormously to this day, this World Monuments Day, World Heritage Day. I have to say both names. I think it's been terrific having you. So any final comments? Roger?
Yes, I think I'm just gonna close with a quote that Kateryna mentioned, that is, for whom we're protecting heritage if people are gone. So I think that's a really important question that brings it back to heritage is for and by the communities that live on it and work with it. So I think that's where we have to put the focus on.
Right. Very good. Anything, Jonathan?
I'll just add to that you mean this is all heritage is about people, and that's where I think that we as a field need to do a slightly better job of really understanding the impact of our work, because I think it is typically very positive, but we're not always good at measuring that, and so we need some better tools and experience doing so.
Very good. Kateryna, I'm going to give you the last word, and best wishes you're in our prayers, and we're going to twist some arms in the Congress to get the money that has been promised to Ukraine. But please close us out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having all of us. It's been a pleasure. Please believe in Ukraine and believe in the Venice Charter, because in the end of the day, in any uncertainty, this is a solid ground and solid foundation where you can start from. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Be well.